Welcome back to Java Programming for Beginners, and today I want to focus on loops because you're going to use loops all the time in programming. It makes doing really long tasks really easy to do and more practical to do on a computer than by hand in real life. And you'll use loops all the time in any kind of application. You'll definitely use them for any kind of computer game you might ever want to make. And loops are just extremely important. And so we're just going to go and start by making a new project. And we're going to click Java Project, next. And for our project name, we're just going to call it Loops. So that's nice and simple. And then we're going to go to source, make a new class, and let's just call it main. I think I did that for one of the tutorials anyways. So we need a main method. So let's go ahead and type out our main method. And if you notice, our main method never changes. It's exactly the same every time, even if I keep making mistakes this time. So there it is. Now what a loop does is it basically goes through a chunk of code and then it goes back and then goes through the chunk if it checks a Boolean value, and depending on what type of loop it is and what the Boolean value is, it will either go through the code again or it will be finished and go on to the next section of code, if that makes any sense. There are two kinds of loop. Well, that's not true. There are more than two kinds of loops in Java, but we're only going to talk about two because the others are not really worth spending time on. The first one is very simple and it's called a while loop. And a while loop is defined by saying while, two parentheses for your Boolean value, and then you open a little block with these little brackets. So while the Boolean value is true, the code inside these two brackets is going to be executed every time. Now you got to be careful because with a while loop it's extremely easy to create an infinite loop. And infinite loops are bad because it's hard to stop your program when it gets into an infinite loop. Not to mention the user is going to get pretty angry if there's an infinite loop in your program. So let's go ahead and define a variable. We're going to say integer, and this is going to be really simple. We're not going to do anything fancy. We're just going to say integer, I don't know, counter. And we're going to put it at 0. And then while counter is less than 20, we want to execute our code. Now the first thing you should probably do is make it so that your counter changes its value. So we're going to say counter equals counter plus 1. And that way, no matter what, counter will get greater than 20 and it won't be an infinite loop. So I always put that little statement in right away so I don't forget about it. And then, we're not really doing anything special. So we'll say system.out.println, and we'll say output number, and then after the quotation marks plus counter. And then we'll just keep track of how many counts are going on in this little program. And so let's go ahead and hit run. And you can see we have a ton of output numbers all the way up to 19. Now if you're wondering, well, why didn't it go to 20? Well, we said less than 20. And we started at 0. And there are actually 20 numbers from 0 to less than 20. You end at 19 and you start at 0. I don't know if I'm not explaining this very well, but I think you'll understand once we get more into this. So if you wanted to go to 20, you could set this equal to 0. Well, not equal to 0. You could set it less than or equal to 0. And then you go to 20. Well, then you might be asking, well, why don't you just change this counter to equal to 1? And there's nothing wrong with doing that, except it's kind of unconventional. You could set this equal to 1, and then that way the counter starts at 1 and goes to 20. And the only thing that's, hold on, well, we're less than 20. We still got to be equal to 20. Sorry about that, guys. But, you might be wondering why I always set it to 0. And the reason why is that's kind of how it works by convention. And when we start talking about arrays, you'll understand why you always start at 0 and not 1. But, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to 0. And this is basically just how a while loop works. So let's go ahead and show you what a for loop is. A for loop is pretty easy to use, and I use it. It's probably the type of loop that you will use the most. But there's actually 4 parts to a for loop. And so we're going to define for loop, and then we have parentheses and an open block. But there's more than just a Boolean value that goes into the for loop. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable, and I'm going to call it index. And that's you'll understand why I call it index later. But then we'll say index is less than 15, semicolon, index plus plus. Now you might be wondering, what is this? You just put 3 statements into a block of parentheses. Well, the first thing we do is we're defining a variable. And then the second part, we're checking for our Boolean. And we're saying if our index is less than 15, then we're going to go ahead and execute all the code in this block. And then if after the for loop is finished, we're going to do this little index plus plus. And you're probably like, whoa, what is this? The plus plus is called an increment. And there's also a minus minus called a decrement. And an increment basically adds one number to the variable that it's being used on. So this is basically doing the same thing as our counter equals counter plus 1. And it actually calls this at the end of our for loop too, which makes it extremely useful to us. So we're just going to do a quick test. We're going to say system.out.println, and we'll go ahead and say, we'll just print out the number. And so let's go ahead and hit run. And here's our output from the while loop. And then down here is our output from the for loop, and it works just the same as, pretty much just the same as the while loop, except our output's just a little bit different. And that's how you use loops. And as you notice, once the while loop is finished, it moves on to the next bit of code, which is a for loop. So these loops are extremely important. You're going to use them in just about every single program that you make. And actually, we're going to use it more and more and more in the next video. I'm really sorry, guys, that these videos have not been too interesting. I mean, right now, you guys don't know enough of the basics for me to actually go out and start making a text-based computer game or something like that. But for now, this is what we can do. In the next video, I plan on showing you guys how to handle user input and stuff. So make sure you subscribe, that way you can see that video when I release it. And I'd just like to thank you guys for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you can see the rest of my videos, and leave a comment down below if you have a question.